It's really gratifying for me to be invited to speak to organizations like this one, to be able to come back to KU. I've come with my daughter tonight, Anjali, who is about to graduate as an undergraduate here at the University of Kansas. And lives just a block away, so the after party is at Anjali's place. We can give you details after my remarks. It's also really gratifying for me to see the level of attendance tonight, the level of sponsorship by law firms and others, the level of faculty attendance and support. I have not attended this dinner previously, but it's really great to see, and I'm happy to be part of it with you. What I wanted to do tonight was just describe to you briefly what maybe is my somewhat ambivalent attitude I've had towards recognition of and celebration of diversity. And my parents, as was explained, my parents immigrated to the United States as students and then came to Canada as permanent residents in the early 1960s. And what's important about that is my family came to Canada in about 1963, ahead by about 5 to 8 years of the large waves of immigration that came after liberalization of various immigration laws. So throughout my life, my brother, sister, and I, among our Indian circle of friends, were constantly engaging in firsts. We were the first to graduate from high school. We were the first to go to college. We were the first to get married, and heaven forbid, in some cases, marry white people. So in all of that, we were ahead of large waves of immigration. And I grew up in a town called London, Ontario, between Detroit and Toronto, about 250,000 people, which makes it one of the 10 largest cities in Canada at the time, but it had a very small Indian community. And because of that, I think, as my siblings and I were growing up, there was a real emphasis from my parents, and certainly I think the three of us as children, although we may not have understood the term, there was an emphasis on assimilation, on fitting in, on being just like everyone else. So we played local sports. We played basketball in Canada. We also, in high school, played varsity badminton. We also both played hockey. We listened to local music, and as Anjali can attest, I remain a devoted fan of, from Bob Dylan to the Grateful Dead to 1950s and 60s jazz music to, so we did those things. Also, and this was after the decision in Abington v. Shemp, but in Canada, prohibitions of school prayer came a little bit later. We also, I remember as a young child in public schools, taking my turn with my classmates, standing in front of the class, leading the class in the Lord's Prayer, and a Bible verse I had selected. And I can remember my father being incensed about that, and my mother saying to him in a way that, as I remember it, really breaks my heart, "Suraj, don't say anything. This is their country. Just leave it alone and let them do what everybody else is doing." I also, our parents spoke to my siblings and I in Hindi at home, but and I think they encouraged that we answer them, at least when we were young, in English, because there was an emphasis that they were very concerned that we speak unaccented English. And so even to this day, to my embarrassment, I don't speak Hindi. I understand kind of kitchen or conversational Hindi, but I don't speak it. So also, while we were in Canada, although I know that others have faced far more serious forms of discrimination, we faced name-calling, minor scuffles at school and in public places. I can remember thinking about going out to public places, to movies, to concerts, etc., with other Indian children that I knew, and hesitating to do that and being uncomfortable about doing that. More significantly, I know that my father faced discrimination in his employment with a local medical school. I heard about 15 years later, as one of my cousins attended medical school in Toronto, they asked him if he was related to my father. And apparently the story was notorious, that my father had been a celebrated research physician and academic for 16 years at a university hospital, and was only offered a full professorship there after he announced that he was leaving to come to Kansas City to engage in private practice. I also remember him talking about, when we were young, sitting in an admissions committee meeting where he sat on the admissions committee at the medical school, and as they reviewed applications, his colleagues making fun of the foreign names of some of the applicants. So as a consequence of all of those things, and even though I was born in India, at some level I was embarrassed by and or sought to distance myself from my Indian heritage. I would hesitate to bring friends home when my father's mother would come for her extended stays at our home. She spoke very little English, and I didn't want to expose my friends to that part of my life. And at some level, I think, as I moved into my professional career, I don't think I really identified myself as Indian as I went to law school, as I began my college career. You know, a few recent events brought this ambivalence home to me in a kind of interesting way. One, and I do have one audio visual, so you won't just be listening to me prattling. My brother recently sent me a picture that he found in a box of old pictures, and he digitized it in whatever way that happens. As you can tell, I'm very adept at technology, and you're about to see a further example of that. But it's a picture of my 7th or 8th grade class, and it's probably 3 separate classes, because it looks like about 60 or 70 kids, and I want to show it to you now. First of all, the statute of limitations has certainly run on the hairstyles and fashion in this picture. And I'd ask you, if you can, and I know it's small and you're far away, see if you can identify me in the picture. I found this picture very interesting for many reasons. Frankly, my first 2 quote-unquote girlfriends are in this picture. Also, I mean, it was 7th grade, so what that means, I don't entirely know. Also, several male friends that certainly I remember very fondly. So I took the picture home to show my wife and my younger daughter. Anjali was here at KU, I think, at the time. And I pulled it up on my iPad, and my younger daughter blurted out as soon as she looked at it. She said, "Daddy's the only brown one." And she started laughing. And that was interesting to me from a number of different perspectives. One, the ease with which she said that, unselfconsciously, something that maybe I felt very sensitive about. The other thing, that in looking at that picture, honestly, when I received it from my brother, I hadn't noticed that. Because I was looking at my classmates and thinking of specific people and what their names were, etc. And I think it's an example of the fact that as I thought back to that time, I was looking at myself as just one more of the students there, maybe submerging the level at which my own experiences, my own background were different from theirs. As another example, and I'm gonna, so that you're not staring at this picture, I will take it off, before anybody takes a picture of that picture. While I was practicing at Lathrop and Gage, an organizational meeting was held for the Asian American Bar Association of Kansas City, now a thriving organization. I'm pleased to see some of the officers of the organization here tonight, and that they're sponsoring this event. Their first event, all the organizers could fit at a single table at Bowling's restaurant. And they came up with a mailing list to invite to that restaurant, literally by going through the bar directory and looking for people with Asian-sounding last names. What I want to say about that, though, is I did not attend that meeting. I have a vague recollection, but only vague, of receiving an invitation. And I have to admit that at that time, I had not been particularly active in the Asian legal or other Asian organizations. And frankly, really did not become that way until becoming a judge 9 years ago, when I started to receive invitations to speak or participate in events like this one. Frankly, I have to say, it hadn't occurred to me until somebody pointed out to me that I was the first judge of Indian ancestry, or born in India, or South Asian judge who had ever been appointed in Missouri, and very likely one of the first who had been appointed in the United States. At some level, that's just, I think, going back to my childhood, just not a way I identify myself. And yet, even if mentally I would make efforts to ignore or deny or submerge that part of my background, or separate it into a separate, there's a family life, an extended family that I have that's my life as an Indian person versus my professional life, reminders of difference or diversity can be hard to ignore sometimes. For example, I was thinking about, as I was preparing remarks tonight, something that maybe I should have been I'm more distressed about now than when it actually happened. My wife and I lived in Chicago when I clerked for a judge after graduating from law school. And we lived in the Lincoln Park area, and so we parked, wherever we could find a parking place. You park on the street, and then you don't want to move your car because you'll never find another. We went out to our car one day in a row of cars, and it was early in the morning. Many of them hadn't been moved. And our car had KKK spray painted on the windshield. And we looked at all the other cars. There was no other car that had been defaced in that way. And my wife said to me, this seems to be targeted at a specific vehicle. Maybe somebody saw us getting in or out of the car. And so that's an event that it's a little hard to deny that you're receiving attention because of certain attributes. Also, after I was appointed, I stood for retention in the general election in 2010. Stood on the ballot with 5 other judges from our court. Our court only has 11 members, but it turns out, and we served 12-year terms, but it turns out by happenstance, 5 of us were on the ballot simultaneously. So actually a decent sample size from our court in the retention election. There were over 500,000 votes cast. Our district covers about 45 counties in the northwestern part of Missouri. I was on the ballot with 4 judges whose names I'll give you because I think it's significant here. James Edward Welsh, Karen Mitchell, Mark D. Pfeiffer, Victor C. Howard. They're all excellent judges. They all have excellent reputations. They all deserved retention. All 4 of them, as did I, received positive, frankly enthusiastic recommendations through the evaluation process through the Missouri Bar. The votes in favor of the retention of the other 4 judges ranged from 64.7% to 66.6%, so within 1.9 percentage points of each other, all 4 of them. The vote for my retention was 60.3%, 4 percentage points lower than that of my colleagues, more than 24,000 additional negative votes than the nearest of my colleagues. There were actually 3 counties, which it turns out were the earliest counties to report on that night, where I lost those counties. The no vote exceeded the vote in my favor. And actually, bless her heart, one of my other judges who had worked for Jay Nixon and had been involved in election campaigns called me at 7:15. The polls closed at 7, at which point my brother in Illinois saw that I was losing. And she called me and she said, the counties that report first are rural counties. They're small counties. It's a total of 1,500 votes, and not to worry about it. And she was right. But that's another example. I tried to tell myself, well, voters are making individual decisions about individual judges. They're studying the ballot, and they've studied our opinions. I honestly did. I tried to persuade and I had a very interesting conversation with my brother that night after the vote had turned in my favor. And he said what I was thinking. He said, I like to feel like I belong here. But there are times at which, at least in certain quarters, you're reminded that there are people who see certain superficial characteristics and form certain judgments. Anyway, obviously far more important than these minor events in my life, we've experienced, and I don't feel like I could appear in front of a group like this tonight without mentioning the tragic shootings in Olathe a few weeks ago, the shooting of a Sikh gentleman near Seattle more recently. Obviously, there were shootings at a Sikh temple in Wisconsin in 2012 that resulted in 6 fatalities. Also, more recently, and maybe I'm just more attuned to it lately, I seem to see signs of a growing xenophobia that I didn't at least notice before. In 3 recent instances, I've noticed prominent displays of the Confederate flag that I don't remember noticing. One, maybe the most poignant, the day after the general election, I was driving to Columbia for the investiture of our newest judge. And as I was driving with 2 of my colleagues, both of whom happened to be African American, twice we saw pickup trucks on the frontage roads plainly trying to create a display for those traveling on I-70 with Confederate flags in the bed of the pickup trucks. And one of the other judges said to me something that said it very matter-of-factly. She said, they're doing a victory lap. And so, frankly, as I drove with my daughter to go visit Truman State University, as she's looking for schools in Kirksville, I also noticed 3 houses on the way to Kirksville with the Confederate flag prominently displayed outside of them. So it's hard to escape reminders of the fact that I, like so many of you, may be different from what many people consider to be an average or normal or real American. Recent events only make it more important, I think, for diverse communities in the legal profession and elsewhere to stand up with their allies, respond to words and actions born of hatred and animosity, and proclaim that this is our America as much as it's anyone else's. And frankly, that's part of the reason seeing all of you here tonight and being part of this event. And I'm a little surprised. I'm maybe a little more moved than I expected as I'm here. That's why events like this are so important, and frankly, to see the turnout and the level of support is so meaningful, I'm sure, not just to me, but to so many of the other people who are here tonight. I think events like this are a wonderful way for people in minority communities to acknowledge and celebrate the backgrounds and attributes that make them different. None of you should be required to submerge or hide your individuality in order to advance in your chosen profession. And I think there's a real strength that can come from interacting with others who have experienced many of the same challenges that you have, even if their appearance and background may be different than yours. I remember I spoke to a group of Asian professionals in Kansas City, and afterwards, an individual who was born in China and grew up in California came up to me, and it never would have occurred to me that he would say to me in a passionate way, and I'd spoken some of the things I've spoken to you about feeling in part, a part of 2 worlds, of being embarrassed or not being able to assimilate all of that into a single identity, of not being able to speak Hindi. And he said to me, that's my experience. That's my life. I've faced all those same issues. I've faced all those same challenges. And nobody would have mistaken us for brothers. But there was something very affirming and heartening about that. And I hope all of you, through the diverse student organizations, through events like this one, are having experiences like that. In addition to the personal rewards and reaffirmation that diverse student organizations and these sorts of events can offer, I'd also just mention at a more instrumental level to the students here, they can also offer valuable assistance as you embark on your legal career. As I learned most dramatically as I applied to become a judge, the legal profession really is relational, by which I mean, and I think all of us who are practicing or are in the field know, to become truly successful in this profession, either by developing a thriving practice, by being appointed as a judge, by becoming a leader in the legal community, all of it requires fostering and developing relationships with others. Frankly, I think that's why immigrant communities may be slow to enter professions like the legal profession as opposed to other professions where the social aspect of it may be somewhat less important. But to the students, you can develop these relationships in many different ways, through political activities, general bar organizations, civic activities, religious institutions. But this is one more and an important community of interest that I'd encourage you to remain involved in, one that you should consider yourselves fortunate to have, and in which I'm gratified to be a part. I applaud the law school for supporting diverse student organizations and this event, and I thank, again, all of the people who have sponsored this event, and thank you for inviting me to come speak with you tonight.